All right, so hello and welcome to the Property Trio again. And today is part two of the auction campaign from the agent's viewpoint. How are you, Cate and Mike?
Really good, Dave.
Well, I'm nervous. I mean, auction day's coming up in this
Yes.
hypothetical high pressure situation.
Oh, I'm
It's like we're
relieved.
getting
I wrote those questions out and we get 2 for 1.
getting to the Friday night where you catch up with a mate, have a couple of reds and discuss your plans for the next day and how you're going to handle it.
Oh, yeah, you won't be
Um,
drinking red. You'll be just freaking out. Vendors get so nervous.
So there's so much for us to cover. So how about we jump straight into it?
Yeah.
So Cate, before we get to the actual auction day, can you talk us through a bit about what's been the experience of the vendor over that 3 or 4 week campaign, and their visibility around what's happened during that process just prior to before they get to auction day?
Yeah, if they've got a great agent, they'll have a lot of visibility. If they've got a lazy or a bad agent, they could be blindsided. So it's a critical day for vendors. But I see so many really well-managed campaigns. So, the agents that are doing that do a great job. They provide reports each week. And so they'll get a printed report and they'll be talking their vendors through it. They'll be looking at online metrics. So on the search engines, how many hits, how many clicks, how much engagement are they getting? How many online inquiries? They'll be tracking the numbers of people that are coming through opens and identifying them as well. It's very rare, unless they're getting 75 at the door and people are sneaking through. Most agents will catch everyone and know who's who. And so the vendor gets that information. They can see who's come back for a second inspection, who's bought their parents, who's talked to the agent about pricing. And then, of course, the closer you get to auction day, you've got genuine markers that can indicate interest. So, for example, requesting a contract and the contract's issued, asking for terms, coming back with some contract questions. They might be saying, my lawyers reviewed the contract and can we strike special condition 9? Can we have 47 days instead of 60 days settlement? They're the things that an agent will track in their notes. And so the vendor is getting a great appreciation. And particularly if someone's invested financially in this, if they've organised a building and pest inspection, they've already put down their, $600 or $700. And so the agent can anticipate, short of the inspection turning up some bad results, that buyer will be bidding. So that's the type of feedback that they should be anticipating, so that they're going into auction probably petrified, but with a decent idea of whether they'll have a lineup of buyers or whether they're preparing for a pass-in.
How sophisticated are agents, and what's the spectrum in terms of like, okay, he's been open for inspection 1, and here's the email. These are the 12 groups that came through. Here's a bit of information on the conversation with each of them, or is it just pick up the phone and have a casual chat? And what's the spectrum of the sophistication of the different agencies with that type of communication and tracking of information and data?
Yeah, so the data's there. It's very rare to get an agency that doesn't have the metrics from the online listing and the CRM. Back in the day, we used to write buyers on a sheet and you'd have the triplicate and you'd leave the green one on the bench for the vendors to see who's come through, and then you'd make your calls that night, order pizza in the agency office and get a bit of an understanding who's likely to be there on auction day. It's very sophisticated now, really sophisticated. But in terms of the dialogue and the style of communication, a good agent will work out what their vendor wants and needs, because you might be dealing with a blokey bloke who's happy to get the phone call. They don't want to read through a report. They trust their mate. He's sponsoring the local footy club. That kind of dialogue can be very relaxed, but it's thorough. And then you've got someone who's a micromanager and they want to see all of the stats. A good agent will be able to produce at either end of that spectrum the right information, and it's all about the integrity of the information. So if the agent's got it right, they know how many likely bidders and who's a smoky. A smoky is someone that might come out of the woodwork on auction day. And it also comes down to the type of property, because if you've got a first home buyer magnet and it's not a brand new property and it might have its quirks, you can anticipate that every serious buyer is probably going to get a building inspection. But if you've got a land sale and it's an old knockdown, you might have people bidding on auction day that you have not met. They haven't walked through the property because they don't need to. They've called council. They've worked out that they can run a bulldozer through it. They've managed to get a contract somehow. If they want to stay unidentified, they'll get a mate to get it. And so an agent with a knockdown will have far less visibility on who's likely to bid than an agent managing something that will attract building inspections. And that's the hard reality.
Even with a house, Kate, I think, was it you that told me a story about being at an auction and a lady was walking past with a dog and eventually became the owner of the property?
Yeah, that's called a walk-up. And I've had many over the years where the buyer has seen the property for the first time in that half hour before the auction, but I've only had one that I can think of where the buyer has arrived and hasn't inspected. They've actually walked past during the auction. They haven't been able to go inside and they've put their hand up. It can happen.
Wow.
Yeah, it does happen. We talked about changing price quotes and taking early offers, but let's talk about approaching auction day. What can go wrong for the agent in the final week?
Yeah, the final week, you can't really go resetting the price. That campaign has had its exposure, and in that final week, you're just preparing for auction day. And if you suddenly lose buyers, what do? Do you ring up all of the other ones and say, look, I've got a really motivated vendor, they're really serious on the day? That's when you get that phone call. It's usually because the agent's got their doubts and something's gone wrong at the last minute. Buyers can drop off. Some of the reasons for this might be a bad building and pest inspection, issues in the contract. The contract might show up something that nobody knew. It could have an easement across the back, or there's any number of things that can be in a contract that the agent and the vendor didn't properly understand, or the vendor didn't disclose until the contract arrived in the agent's inbox. And in some states and territories, you can start the campaign without having the contract. Certainly in Victoria, that's one risk that the agents run. You can have a sudden change of circumstances. So the buyer suddenly gets posted interstate, or they lose their job, or something's happened. Finance delays is a big one. That's a significant reason why I might think I'm up against 3 other people and then all of a sudden it's just me and one other. It's because the vendors thought they had all these people, and the buyer's bank or broker couldn't get them pre-approval in time for auction day. And that's the risk, because a buyer sees a property, they fall in love with it, go to the bank or the broker and say, I've got to be ready by the 31st of August. The broker says, oh my gosh, we'll get it on escalation, get us all the documents, we'll try and get you pre-approval in time. And unfortunately it doesn't. So that's a challenge that can be averted, but often it's not. And then you've got parents that come through and talk it down and throw the buyer off the property. So there's some of the things that can cause buyers to drop off. Buyers can also switch to other campaigns. And I was chatting to you both last episode about the listing that was 8 to 880, and then the comparable listing that's quoted 9 to 990. Well, all the buyers are going to rush to the 8 to 880 house because they think they'll get a better deal, regardless of the fact that they're both very similar houses and they're probably worth the same. Imagine if you've got a listing and it's been going really well, and in that last week, an industry colleague, someone in an office down the road, or maybe someone from your own office, lists a similar property or a slightly better property for a lower price. Well, you're going to lose your buyers because they all want to have a crack at 3rd Avenue. They no longer want to be on 1st Avenue. I've seen that happen, and it's horrible. Another issue is when contracts aren't ready, and there are delays to contract preparation across the board. You might be waiting on a strata certificate, an owner's corporation, or a body corporate certificate. They can be delayed. If they're not ready in time, you have to push your auction back. And then you've got other legal issues, like they've lost the title, or there's family court issues, or maybe it's an off-the-plan sale and it's not ready yet. You haven't got titles. And so there's lots of reasons why in that last week things can go wrong.
With the campaign sort of price being locked in, as you say, for the last week, and the agent's kind of thinking, righto, it's all about game day. In that tense week in the lead up, are there curveballs that the vendor can throw at the agent that they have to manage on the fly? Because I'm guessing they're nervous and they'd be having all sorts of fancy notions.
Yeah, the vendor can throw curveballs. One of the most annoying curveballs for agents is when they've had people in their ear about what the property could be worth, especially if the market's moving. if they've seen a compelling sales result in that final week, or even on the morning of their auction, I've seen it before. I remember a vendor saw some strong result at the 10 a.m. auction, and then at 11, the agent's reserve price that they'd told me is vanished, and they've got a different price tag. Sometimes the kids are all over it, talking to them about what it's worth. There are other times, though, that a vendor can change their mind about selling. I've seen that happen as late as auction day. There was one, they were separating, and they decided on Friday night they wanted to get back together.
Oh, well, good for them.
No, but bad for me.
Bad
and
for
I've
you.
seen situations where nanas decided to sell the house to the grandkids for a peppercorn. So it doesn't matter that my buyer's in love with the property and they're prepared to pay market value. Nana's doing the deal with the grandies. There's some of the challenges that can come up when a vendor, the agent thinks that they've got the vendor firmly in the saddle, and all of a sudden, it's not going to plan.
So, Cate, let's assume the auction campaign doesn't derail. What happens on auction day that buyers won't typically be aware of?
Yeah, they won't be aware of the fact that the auction reserve price hasn't necessarily been set, and sometimes the agents are in there having these debates and battles about the issues I've just spoken about. Bob down the road reckons that the house that sold for $1 million over compares to this one when it actually doesn't. It might be different land size, or it could be a different zone, or there's something that this vendor's not paying attention to, and they're out of control. Most buyers wouldn't realise that the agent doesn't always get to set the reserve or have that degree of influence. And so they're inside talking about the reserve price maybe after the bell's rung. They're still working out
Unknown
exactly.
to them.
It can happen.
Just on that, I think that's a really interesting point. Can we delve into that a little bit deeper? Like, what are some of the pros and cons for a vendor to keep that up their sleeve until auction day, versus being a bit more transparent and sharing it with the agent early on in the campaign?
I personally think that the only reason why you wouldn't have that firm auction reserve conversation with your agent prior to auction day is because there's a critical auction taking place that will become a data point in your comparable sales analysis. And I've seen agents say, you know what, let's see what that 10 o'clock auction goes for, because that will underpin where we think this should land. And I know that I've got overflow with the buyers. We've had the same buyers through the campaign as what that property will have had. So we'll be getting the overflow. We might even have the underbidder there. So that's the only time I think that is sensible, unless the vendor has a particular need to sell at a certain price. And I don't think that vendors should let their financial obligations and requirements really
it doesn't dictate what the market does it?
Yeah, that's right.
Your own,
But if they're making a critical sell or don't sell decision, because some vendors will be saying, if I can't get 1.6 for this house, I'd actually rather stay in it. So I'm prepared to pay for the auction campaign and go through this rigmarole because I think I should be able to get 1.6. But if by chance I can't, I'm not selling. We'll give it a go in a couple of years. You do get those vendors. So they're the reasons why you might not set your reserve. But I think you owe it to your agent to have those conversations with them so that everyone's on the same page. And in particular, you're not giving yourself a heart attack on the morning of auction because you're carrying all of those stressful decisions and making your mind up, in a highly tense time frame.
And would you suggest they have that conversation prior to beginning the auction campaign, 1 week in, 2 weeks in, once they get a bit of a sense of, the desirability, how many people are interested in the property?
I think that it's a conversation that should be had at the onset and then take each other's temperature all the way through. The agent is meant to be your trusted advisor, and they might be saying, how you said you'd sell for 1.6. I don't want to pump your tyres up too quickly, but I reckon we've got that covered. We might even be looking at a 1.65 or a 1.7 result. And they can guide the vendor throughout the campaign. Or they might be saying early on, I don't want to waste your time. If you genuinely don't want to sell under 1.6, I can't say that we can get that. Do you want to pull the campaign now or just put it on for private sale? The conversations should be had throughout the campaign so that the agent can manage the vendor's expectations and process accordingly.
Yeah, that's great. Really good insights. Over to you, Mike.
Yeah, sorry, I'll jump into my one. I had the pleasure of watching you at auction some years ago. I think I had a presentation in Melbourne, and I had some spare time, and you invited me along, and a bit like a bit like establishing kind of like an emotional connection in a movie where there's this tragedy. I sort of said, like, what can you tell me about, who you're bidding for and their background? And you told me everything, and I remember you telling me your exact budget, and I still remember standing there going, geez, I could set fire to this thing by blurting out one number. I don't know why. I guess I'm very childish. But what struck me was just how strategic every single thing was on the day, where you stood, your posture, how you interact with the agent, how you faced other people. I mean, it just really showcased to me that there's an extreme trade craft, and it was quite an intense thing as well. And I'm guessing it's very intense, not just for the bidders, but for the vendors as well. And I've witnessed, there's often a point where the kind of pressure gets to a point, and then the agents kind of go, all right, we just need to calm down here a little bit. I'm going to go inside and speak to the vendors because we're approaching maybe reserve, or we're getting a little bit serious. What's going on there? And can you sort of tell us what happens behind the scenes there? Because I know you've been in sales as well.
Yeah, we call it the halftime show, but the real word for that is referral. So the agent will refer the bid to the vendor. What that means is they haven't declared it on the market yet. So a referral auction means that the agent can say, ladies and gentlemen, we're taking a break. We'll be back with you in just a minute. We'll have a chat to the vendor. We'll come out with instructions. And the instructions that they're seeking are, put it on the market. Because when the vendor does that, the agent comes bursting out the door. They've got a very different gait with their step to when the vendor says, I'm still nervous. Can you get it a bit higher before you call it on the market? The agent walks differently, I can tell you that much. So when the agent comes out and says, ladies and gentlemen, we're playing for keeps, it's on the market. Can you, madam,
because they know they're going to get paid, right?
Yeah. And that selfish element, we'll put that to the side, because I'd like to think most agents nurture the vendor and want a great result for them, because it gives the agent a great, advertising billboard as well when they've got a big crowd watching them get an enormous result. But
Sure.
they want to get their vendor a great result. So they come out, they call it on the market, they ask me to confirm my bid. And then the hope is that everyone else comes out of the woodwork and the bidding starts to fly. There's a lot of agents that will say to their vendors inside, I know you're not quite where you want it to be, but we've got momentum and we think that you need to put it on the market to get it running. And that's a really hard decision for a vendor to make, because they've had that pre-auction conversation and said, well, the reserve is 1.6, but if you think it's really rolling at, 1.55, you've got our permission to put it on the market early. But a lot of vendors won't say that. They'll say, no, our reserve really is 1.6. And so if the agent's got a few bidders in the crowd and then they've got a smart aleck like me saying, well, are we on the market or not? Can you please refer the bid? They'll go inside. So it's very, very important that the bidders listen to the dialogue when they're at the auction, because if an agent says it's a non-referral auction, that means that they've got control of this whole thing. They're not going inside for the halftime show. So don't wait for them to do that before you bid, to get your bid in.
A buyer's agent once told me, might have even been you, that you never get an authority on sort of like a round number. Does that kind of dictate then that the vendor's reserve is always typically a round number, or is it more about the buyers kind of going, we're max going to this, and they don't think 1.61 or 1.601, they think 1.6 and then that's it. So if you've got 1.601, you could actually literally beat them with $1,000.
Yeah, that's right. The scarcity is the fact that you've got multiple people going for a property and putting price tag on it means that you've got to differentiate yourself with that tiny little bit extra. For the vendor, there's only one vendor. So yes, usually it is a round figure, and it might end at a 5. It usually ends in a 0, and you'll see it. You'll see the agent's posture change when they know that they're on the market. But if we're talking about what happens behind the scenes, it's good for the crowd or for the bidders to understand what could be happening inside. That vendor's making a critical decision to put their property on the market for a price that they might not be as excited about. And the risk to them is, if I'm holding that bid and I'm at 155 and they really wanted 16. And the agent manages to get them to agree to put it on the market. Comes running outside and says, we're playing for keeps, and no one else bids. Then I've bought that property for 50 grand less than the vendor wanted. Whereas if the agent had passed it in to me and said, we're nearly there, we're really close, no one else is bidding, I'm passing it into you, Cate, I'll go inside. They'll tell me that the real price is they'll probably tell me the real price is 165 because they want to have a negotiation, and we might do the deal at 16. So that's the risk to the vendor. They might make the auction run and give it that fantastic fuel that it needs, or they might undersell it.
So that leads
us, and this isn't even a real thing.
Yeah, and so that leads us nicely into the next phase of what can happen in auction. So what happens behind the scenes, Cate? Let's share that with our listeners. When you're the highest bidder, but it hasn't hit reserve and it's been passed in to you, and you get to negotiate.
Yeah, well, let me tell you something a bit sneaky. I've seen plenty of situations where the agents have recognised that they've got one strong bidder. They have actually reached reserve, but that bidder still wants the property and they can tell that they've got a bit more fuel in them. They'll pass it into that bidder and bring them inside and get even more money out of them. That can happen. So you've got to be thinking, what's the likely conversation when that happens? I go inside, I sit down the back, I wait for the agent to come down and tell me what the reserve is. I know when they've puffed it up and they're trying to get a bit more out of me.
How?
Well, I know my values to start with. And so I'll say, that's ridiculous. Tell me how the vendor landed at that. That's a stupid price. That was never worth that and I'm not paying it. So what's your science behind that?
Yeah.
And the agent won't be foolish enough to tell me about a property that doesn't compare, because we're both there. They might say to me, and in fact, invariably, they blame it on the family. Oh, I know, Cate, I had this conversation with him during the week, and then today, Uncle Bob's down there telling him it's worth more. And that's hard for the agent when they have had the goalposts moved. Then I've got to make sure that I negotiate through that agent, because I'm not face-to-face with the vendor at this stage. They're in the front bedroom, I'm down in the lounge. That's how it goes. And so I've got to make sure that I don't offend them, but I put some pressure on them and I try and give them a bit of a reality check. And I also, by this stage, I knew on Thursday or Friday where the agent was pitching the reserve, because they generally tell me because I ask. And I also know what comparable sales we're all working off, because I'll have those conversations. And if the agent's finding that they've got, a false, an increased expectation, I've got to make that decision. Do I stay here and fight it out, or do I walk away? So I also need to have a bit of an understanding about who else was in the crowd who might be prepared to pay that price, because just because it passed into me doesn't mean that someone else wasn't there who was prepared to pay. Some people don't bid for all kinds of stupid reasons. So I've got to play my cards right. If it passed in and there's no one else, I can just freeze them and wait until Sunday when they come off their cloud, and we'll do the deal on a different day. But if there's others out there who I know could purchase it, I've got to play my cards really carefully. But understanding the conversations that are happening with that vendor, the agents running up and down the hall between me and them, a pass-in negotiation can take over an hour. I had a really good juicy one that took over 2 hours. And the agents, sometimes they have to run to the next auction. If it's a late afternoon auction, they'll just keep negotiating. And you've also got to understand the vendor's motivation to sell, because if they were that vendor that said, if we can't get 16, we're not moving, well, I might have to walk away from the property. But if they're there to sell and they've got the world coming crashing down on them, and they're understanding that what they thought they'd get is not there, we'll get that deal done, but it will take time, and it's very stressful for them.
Cate, on auction day as well, this is a bit of an aside, but it's something you see all the time. The agent shows up in their Mercedes and they're immaculately dressed, and like the crowd, in a way, they're kind of like the enemy to the crowd, and some people get this captive audience and might think they're a bit of a comedian and heckle and cause trouble. What are some of the things that you typically see with these comedians and lowballing and that sort of stuff that goes on?
Yeah, there's the person in the crowd who just hates real estate agents. You often get that. They'll start calling out about underquoting and, are we on the market, are we on the market? They're not even intending on bidding. They just hate agents. Then you'll get someone who wants to bid and they're just trying to throw everyone off the scent. So they'll be asking about the asbestos shed or something to, get the agent to
Yeah, when did the murder happen in the front bedroom
right.
again?
Yeah. And then there are people that think that by behaving aggressively, they'll intimidate others in the crowd. So there's lots of reasons why people heckle. They're the typical three. And there's a difference between heckling and intimidation. And there's a difference between making a pain of yourself and disrupting the auction. Now, if you are genuinely disrupting the auctioneer has the legislated power to stop you from, or to not take your bid. So if you're a bidder and you're going too hard, they'll probably give you a warning, and they can choose not to work with you, which is horrifying. If you've done all your due diligence and then you're there to buy and someone else buys it for a price that you were prepared to pay because the auctioneer decided not to work with you, you've lost the entire battle. So, some of the intimidation that I see might be just an assertive bidder like myself. My job is to try and intimidate, not to stop people from bidding, but to have them
feel
doubt
like you're
themselves.
serious, have a presence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I want to throw someone off their game. I want to see them not stretch their budget. I would like to see them drop out of the auction because it's all just too hard. But I've got to be careful how I do that, because if I'm going too far, the agent can say, Cate, tone it down. And I've been told that before. You walk right up to someone and you're shouting your bids in their face. That kind of stuff is very intimidating.
That's what you got asked to tone it down for. You walked right up to the auctioneer.
No, up to my opposition bidder.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And what caused you to do that?
Because I wanted to get the property for my client. So if it was making them uncomfortable, they might be less unwilling to discuss stretching their budget with their partner. If someone's standing there staring at you and hearing everything you're saying, it's all just too hard. So there are things that people can do that, get you a bit of a warning. But there are some good juicy stories out there, and agents will know how to answer one of those questions when someone's trying to, identify a negative with the property. The agent might receive a question, can you tell us about the asbestos shed? And the agent will say, yeah, we've been really transparent with you throughout the campaign about that shed, and we've given you a few quotes so that you understand what you could do with that shed. Clearly, you're still here, so I can expect your bid. And that will often backfire on the person that was trying to heckle.
Being a smart aleck.
Yeah, because then all the buyers will be like, well, they're just doing that because they want to throw us off the scent. But clearly it's not that big of an issue because they're pointing it out, but they're still here bidding.
And
then
a good
when they do
auctioneer
place their bid, the agent will say, yeah, I'm glad to see that you aren't too stressed about that shed. So agents do have good one-liners to keep it on track.
They've done it a million times before, right?
Yeah.
And you have to be fairly quick, and you have to be quick-witted and an entertainer. And
That's right.
just a note on that intimidation, because I just want to say, like, Cate, intimidation has a negative connotation, but I know you use intimidation, but you're doing it because you have a job to do, and sometimes it's the right approach. And Dave, don't let the fact that Cate's kind of sweet, empathetic, intelligent, sensibilities is all that she has to offer. On auction day, I was scared, and I was standing next to her as her guest.
Yeah, I've seen Cate at auction. I've bidded against her actually.
Yeah,
Oh gosh,
as well.
And you survived.
Yeah, I did.
One example, a real life example of what can go on. I was bidding against a fella back in 2020, just before lockdown started, and he was wanting to bid in small increments, and we weren't on the market yet. And the auctioneer was getting a bit annoyed with him because he really was starting to become a bit of a pest. And the auctioneer said, we're still in 10s, so I'll take your bid if you're in with the 10. And the guy was bidding in 2.5s. And the auctioneer was really clear and said, we're not at reserve yet. I won't be taking your bid. Unless you give me $10,000 bid, I'm passing the property into Cate. We're going inside. Do you understand? And this guy thought that the auctioneer had to take his bid, which obviously was a misunderstanding
to share with everybody.
Yeah, because there are auction rules and the auctioneer can determine the increments. And so in that case, his understanding of auction legislation was incorrect and the auctioneer was giving him fair warning. So the property passed into me And I went inside and this guy came running up to the door and he was saying, no, but I'm prepared to bid higher. You have to take my bid. And I said, mate, he doesn't have to take your bid. You were given fair warning. Now, please move out of the way. I went inside and we did the deal. So I purchased the property and he contacted me that night, tracked me down, found me on my website and said, I'll buy the property back for more. So those vendors would have been inside. That would have been very nerve-wracking for them because the auctioneers passed it into me. These poor vendors are saying, well, there's this guy outside who really wants to buy it. We should have had an auction. So there's some of the things that go on behind the scenes. You know, I could say what was happening in the street, but how did the auctioneer then deal with those vendors? Because he's got to convince them that I'm the right buyer to be dealing with and that getting the right price. It's not always easy for auctioneers.
Yeah, and I think it's a good anecdote that often if you're trying to be too smart by half or too tricky, you actually end up just tying yourself in knots and not doing yourself any favours.
Yeah.
So we're coming towards the end of this great two-part series on running an auction from the agent's perspective, but obviously it's had heaps of insights for potential buyers and sellers as well. Look, I reckon could ask another few more questions, but we just don't have time. So before we get into our gold nuggets, what is your best tip for buyers when it comes to getting the inside running on an auction campaign, Cate?
Well, I've got 3 tips. The first one is don't underestimate the listing agent's power over the campaign. You know, they're the one with the relationship with the vendor. Be respectful and let them know definitively if you're in or out on a property, unless you need to go undercover for whatever reason. So that's my first tip. Second one, ask the agent if there's a chance the property could sell prior to auction. Because if the answer is yes, make sure you stay close to them, or you might want to explore that opportunity further. Establish how they'll deal with competing buyers as well. And then my last one is be auction ready. So get your finance, your due diligence, iron out your terms, deposits, have it all done in case there's an early offer. Because if you're at work and you've got all these deadlines, the phone rings or the text comes through saying, got an acceptable offer, property will sell at 6 p.m. tonight, you need to be able to pull the trigger.
Yeah, and look, I'll double and triple down on that. You know, if you think
break
about
the wheels.
buying, get your pre-approval done as early as possible, because the last thing you want is to be missing out on a property or running around like a headless chook trying to get things organised so you can buy that property. There's enough anxiety when it comes to buying a property. Don't add trying to get your finance organised at the last minute to that, to all the other things you're stressing and worrying about when you're trying to purchase a property, whether it's an auction or private sale. Look, Cate, that's been a great couple episodes, and I think our listeners will really get a heap out of that. So thank you very much for everything, all your knowledge sharing there, and let's look forward to both of your gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
My gold nugget is really just the complexity of this. I mean, we've had to spend 2 episodes really just kind of scratching the surface, and it's similar to my gold nugget from the previous episode. You've really got to value the expertise of someone that does this day in, day out. And if you decide not to use a professional, understand that you are going up against professionals, whether that be a buyer's advocate representing someone that's your competition or the auctioneer themselves. They're better trained and better resourced. So you've got to bring your A game and be ready.
My gold nugget relates to how you're viewed by the vendor. So the agent is a conduit here. They know you and they know the vendor. And if you're that likable, approachable, or straight up buyer that is making their job easy in terms of talking to the vendor about, you know, how legit they think you are, or how strong your offer could be, or just how nice you are, that can have an impact. And I'm not suggesting that you need to be best friends with the agent or tell them your budget. But sometimes it depends on how emotional that vendor is. And if they're wanting to see their property go to someone who will love it, or whatever the emotional overlay is there, the agent's the conduit. So be that person who's memorable for all the right reasons, because it absolutely has a bearing. And remember that agents are humans too, as much as some of us don't want to believe that. They are. And
I was going to say, where's the evidence?
Yeah,
No, that's
they-
unfair.
they have an influence on the vendor. They have an enormous influence. I remember as an agent saying, I know we've got these 3 offers. We called for best and highest. I'm really nervous about this person. And here are the attributes that they've demonstrated that make me nervous. You know, they've cooled off on properties, or they've been really aggressive and they wanted to give me a short time frame. They've not been pleasant to deal with. That can sway a vendor's decision. So we've got to remember that when we're looking at this from the agent's perspective, they're human too, and that carries a bit of weight when they're dealing with a buyer that is just more pleasant to deal with.
Yeah. And look, that can actually happen. I was actually just chatting with a friend's parents who sold a property or did sell the property in Toorak, as it turned out, about, 5-10 years ago. And the person, even though they bought the property on the day, didn't have the money to settle when it came to settlement. So, they've got to be wary of those kinds of things. Those things do happen. And so they had to go through the whole process again. And they had bought another property too.
Ouch. Yeah, stressful.
All right. So, look, thanks again, Cate and Mike. Great couple episodes on running an auction from an agent's perspective, and look forward to catching up with both of you and our listeners in a week's time.
Sounds great. Thanks
See
a
you
lot,
next week.
guys.